Hi guys, Troy at the Full Setup, back with another benchmark review. Now for today's video, I will be benchmarking the brand new RTX 2060 with the Ryzen 2600 at 1080p Ultra settings. I will be testing 11 games with a mix of stock and overclock results for you. Over the next few weeks, I will also be benchmarking 1440p, 4K and ultra high performance, so if you want to see those videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button. As for the RTX 2060, I'm using a Palit Gaming Pro RC with 6GB of GDDR6. This RTX 2060 is using a bin GPU, so as you can see here, it's actually boosting way above its 1830MHz max boost rating, and for the most it's running between 1935 and 2000MHz. As for today's test system, I'm using a Ryzen 2600 with 16GB of 3200MHz DDR4 with some pretty tight manual subtimings on an Asus X370 crosshair. Let's start with stock versus overclock performance. As already mentioned, this card is boosting rather high, so I was only able to add 110MHz to the core. As for the memory, I had a couple of crashes at 1000MHz, so I dropped it down to 900 for this test. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I'm running at ultra settings with TAA enabled. With both the Ryzen 2600 and RTX 2060 at stock settings, we have a minimum of 77 and an average of 95 frames per second. Overclocking the RTX 2060 scores a minimum of 79 and an average of 99 frames per second. Running the Ryzen 2600 at 4.2GHz, but with the GPU at stock scores a minimum of 75 and an average of 95 frames per second. Running both the CPU and GPU overclocked scores a minimum of 80 and an average of 101 frames per second. Moving on to Far Cry 5, again at ultra settings with TAA enabled. For all stock we have a minimum of 74 and an average of 95 frames per second. Overclocking the GPU sees 5% gains with a minimum of 81 and an average of 100 frames per second. Overclocking the CPU but leaving the GPU stock sees even more gains over the previous results, with minimums of 85 and an average of 104 frames per second. And finally we have the entire system overclocked. Minimums are at 88 and averages are at 107 frames per second. Now for the rest of the benchmark, except Battlefield 5, I will be running the Ryzen 2600 at stock settings, but I will be running the GPU overclocked as I'm using Shadowplay to record this footage, so the 5% gains I'm achieving from overclocking are cancelled out due to the fact the 5% loss from screen recording. So what you're actually seeing now on screen is a lot closer to stock footage than it is actually overclocked. Earlier Forza titles do not favour Ryzen's lower frequencies and are very single core heavy, as you can see by the bottlenecks on Forza 7, so I was really happy to see that Forza Horizon 4 has been really well optimised for Ryzen's extra core and thread count. At ultra settings, the RTX 2060 has no trouble pushing average frame rates past 100 frames per second. Moving on to some Battle Royale then, I'm running PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds at ultra settings, and I must say the game is feeling a lot less buggy since the end of year patches. And again, the RTX 2060 has no issues at pushing average frame rates past 100 frames per second. Drop a setting or two and this game would be a joy on a 144Hz panel. Moving on to the most demanding game today then, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This was a title that the 1060 certainly struggles with at max settings. Now the RTX 2060 is more than playable at ultra high settings, but I've dropped the settings down to very high to keep the frame rates always above 60. Personally, I would set the ultra high preset, then just drop a setting or two for this game. Moving on to Black Ops 4 at very high settings, I will be honest, I haven't played this game properly in a while, and I found it really hard to get in a good match. 9 times out of 10 I was dropping down to be wiped out before I could even hit record. That being said, at very high settings, frame rates were always between 100 and 140. Just like PUBG, drop some settings and you have a great 144Hz experience. As for Shadow of War, I am running at stock GPU settings, and as with Tomb Raider and Far Cry, scores were taken when not recording. At ultra settings with TAA enabled, the 2060 scored a minimum of 34 and an average of 105 frames per second. Finally, time to test some ray tracing. I have a whole bunch of Battlefield 5 footage for you at various settings. I'm just going to let this run, then come back with my final thoughts on its ray tracing performance.
Objective easy is now ours. Objective Charlie is ours. Objective Dog has been lost.
So there was the Battlefield 5 footage. Now the 2060 is an entry-level RTX card, and I shouldn't have really tested it at ultra ray tracing settings. This card is really suited to low to medium ray tracing effects, although I found it very nice to look at, and I could really see myself playing the campaign with it on in some form, and DirectX 12 is certainly improving on Battlefield. I still found stutters to be a regular occurrence, and as soon as I stopped looking around at all the beautiful lighting effects and just start shooting people, I forgot that this setting was even on. For me, if I'm playing Battlefield 5, it's going to be in DirectX 11 and normally at low latency settings. But as you can see here at ultra settings, although there is a little bit of bottlenecking, the game runs incredibly well on this system. So there are the benchmarks. So what do I think of the RTX 2060? Well, for a 6 series card, it's certainly expensive. The GTX 1060 at launch was around £250 to £275 in the UK for a 6GB variant. But I think if you can get this model for under $350, it's actually pretty good value. You get 1070 Ti to 1080 level performance at stock settings, and when overclocked you get closer to RTX 2070 performance in non-ray trace titles. Now this card is selling for 1070 prices, with the added extras of basic ray tracing features, and also Nvidia's HVenc encoding on the 20 series is now on par with OBS's medium CPU encoding preset, making this not just a 1080p champ for gaming, but also perfect for streamers and content creators too. Anyway, that's it from me today. I'd be interested on what your thoughts are on the RTX 2060, and as soon as we have more ray tracing games, I will make a separate video for you. Make sure you subscribe to check out all those other benchmarks that are coming. If there's anything you didn't like in the video, let me know. Let me know what you did like, hit me up in the comments section, and I'll be back very soon.